What would you do if your car lost power on the last lap while you were defending your position, and your team told you that everything was fine? That happened to Lewis Hamilton at the 2025 United States GP. But what seemed like just a technical failure ended up becoming a media bomb that exposes Ferrari and its track engineer Riccardo Adami. Today I'm going to tell you the whole story, what happened, what they didn't tell you, and why this incident could be the beginning of an internal rupture at Ferrari. The 2025 United States Grand Prix reached its climax in the last lap with one of the most tense episodes of the year, starring Lewis Hamilton who, despite all his experience, was left completely exposed to a disconcerting situation. The Circuit of the Americas in Austin, Texas, was not only the scene of a strategic and physical battle, but the field where a silent crisis emerged within Ferrari. And it all started in Turn 5. When Hamilton turned on that section of the track, his reaction was immediate and alarming. He abruptly stopped accelerating, applied the brake as a reflex, and his voice on the radio conveyed his confusion. He said he felt like he hit something. At that moment, any driver would think about a possible puncture. But what was strange was not just the feeling of loss of grip, but the abrupt and erratic way in which the car began to behave. There were no previous vibrations, no gradual signals. It was an instant failure without warning. Upon reaching turn 11, one of the strongest braking points on the track, the car did not respond as it should. Hamilton described the sensation as if the car refused to stop. Literally. And meanwhile, from the pit wall, Riccardo Adami, his race engineer, tried to reassure him with a lapidary phrase. The sensors do not detect any anomaly. In other words, for Ferrari the car was fine. But it wasn't. Here a dilemma arises that goes far beyond a technical failure. It's a trust gap between what a driver experiences firsthand and what his team claims through data. When a driver of Hamilton's caliber tells you that something is wrong, an engineer's instinct shouldn't be to ignore him or coldly contradict him with cold, supposedly objective information. Because at the end of the day, technology can fail, but a pilot's senses rarely lie in extreme conditions. Telemetry, reviewed after the race, confirmed that something happened. There was an abrupt speed drop between turns 4 and 5, and a complete disconnection from the car's expected power flow. It was not a tactical decision, nor a piloting error. It was an instinctive response to a real mechanical failure. Hamilton took his foot off the accelerator not because he wanted to, but because the car forced him to do so. And that difference is critical. Furthermore, the comparative lap data shows that last lap was almost a second slower in its middle section compared to the previous one. What is alarming is not only the time lost, but how the car suddenly changed its behavior. Extreme understeer, lack of rear axle traction, and an inability to brake normally. Everything points to a failure within the energy recovery system or in the power delivery of the hybrid engine. But Ferrari has not yet given a convincing official technical explanation. And in the midst of that silent chaos, Hamilton had to improvise. He faced a direct threat from Oscar Piastri, who came with more pace and tires in better condition. One more mistake, a poorly taken corner, and fourth place was lost. However, Hamilton held the car down through reflexes, experience, and sheer mental control. The way he modulated the brakes in the final corners, adapting to a car that was no longer working as it should, was masterful. The public celebrated it, the analysts praised it. But for Hamilton, it was a bitter triumph. Because it wasn't just about crossing the finish line, but about realizing that the team in which he had placed his faith was beginning to fail him at critical moments. And that, for a driver who has won 7 world championships, is the beginning of a doubt that can turn into a break. The Austin incident was not an isolated mechanical failure. It was a mirror that reflected Ferrari's internal cracks. A team that, despite its history and prestige, seems incapable of translating the excellence of its drivers into consistent results. And in that mirror, Hamilton saw himself fighting alone against an invisible enemy, the internal lack of coordination of a team that does not react in time. This seemingly small moment on the season schedule could end up being one of the biggest scenes of the year. Not because of the points that were won or lost, but because of what it revealed about the relationship between Hamilton and Ferrari, a marriage that is beginning to show signs of wear and tear. What happened with Hamilton in Austin was not an isolated case, nor a spontaneous phenomenon. It was rather the inevitable consequence of a series of structural problems that Ferrari has had since the beginning of the season. And all of them converge on the same culprit, the SF25. To compensate, Ferrari resorted to a race management solution, lift and coast. A technique that consists of lifting the foot off the accelerator before the braking point and letting the car roll for a stretch before braking. Its main objective is to reduce the load on the flat bottom, avoid strong impacts against the asphalt and reduce plank wear. But that technique comes at a high price: lap time. In Austin, Hamilton received that order on lap 29, and it wasn't the first time. Ferrari has been applying this strategy almost every weekend since China. And not only with Hamilton, Charles Leclerc has also been forced to use it. This, on any other team, would be a temporary measure. But at Ferrari it has become a pattern. The team has chosen to compromise the aggressiveness of its drivers rather than solve the root problem with an aerodynamic reconfiguration or a redesign of the flat bottom. And this is where the real tension arises between pilot and engineering. But there is something more serious. This lift and coast technique also affects the way the brakes and tires reach their optimal window. Less braking load means less temperature on the discs, which can cause inconsistencies when entering corners. Furthermore, by not accelerating hard at critical points, the front tires cool faster, generating understeer. And that was precisely the feeling that Hamilton described on the last lap in Austin. Extreme understeer, loss of grip, lack of response. What started as a disturbing loss of power on the final lap of the US GP and a strange lift and coast order has quickly escalated into a much deeper controversy. Several analysts, technical media, and paddock experts have begun to ask themselves a question that, in any other team, would sound ridiculous. But at Ferrari, given its historical internal crises, it makes more and more sense. Is the team conditioning, deliberately or not, the performance of Lewis Hamilton's car? It is a serious accusation. But the context makes it inevitable. Since the start of the season, the SF25 has been a difficult car to set up, unstable and especially vulnerable to small changes in altitude, load and track temperature. But the feeling that is repeated in each Grand Prix is that Ferrari has not been able to offer Hamilton a consistent technical environment. And even worse, that, in the face of crisis situations, the team's responses are slow, confusing, or directly contradictory. Patterns began to appear when Hamilton's telemetry data was crossed with that of Charles Leclerc. In several sessions, especially during the middle stints of the race and in qualifying, the data shows that Hamilton has periods of inexplicable disconnection. Areas of the circuit where, for no apparent reason, his car momentarily loses power, delivers less torque, or responds with a delay to acceleration commands. Videos from independent technical channels such as Moz F1 and F1 Prime News have collected this evidence and compared it with the Britain's driving style. There, what they call patterns of electronic hesitancy and lag in the delivery of hybrid energy are revealed, only present in car number 44. In the cross-analysis with Leclerc, the data is clear. There are no similar records in the Monégasque car. This doesn't necessarily imply that anyone at Ferrari is sabotaging Hamilton. But it does raise a serious suspicion. Either the SF25 has specific problems that only manifest themselves in certain configurations, or there is a disconnect between Hamilton's feedback and the team's ability to translate it into real improvements. And in Formula One, a lack of reaction is as dangerous as a malicious action. The radio communications between the two are curt, sometimes tense, and reveal a worrying lack of synchronicity. Hamilton's phrase after the sprint in Austin was revealing, "We were so slow, mate." He said it without anger, but also without hope of receiving a useful technical explanation. It is the phrase of a pilot who knows that he is being held back but cannot prove it. So, all this has generated a new front of discussion: the cultural incompatibility between Hamilton and Ferrari. While Mercedes built a team around its star driver, giving him technical freedom and adjusting procedures to his style, Ferrari continues to operate under a hierarchical paradigm, where drivers execute but do not decide. On the surface, it's just an observation, but in reality it is a sentence. A surgical evaluation, full of resignation and precision, that summarizes everything Hamilton has experienced since his arrival at Ferrari. It was not a message to the public. It was a direct statement to his engineer, Riccardo Adami, and by extension to the technical core of the team. What aggravates the situation is the context in which the message occurred. It came from a sprint race where the car had shown a performance well below expectations. Hamilton felt his pace was deliberately limited by setup decisions that did not match actual track conditions. Once again, he was instructed to drive with caution, to preserve the car's components, to adapt to a conservative plan. Meanwhile, their direct rivals McLaren, Red Bull, and even Mercedes were exploiting their cars to the maximum in search of tenths and positions. The difference is in how the environment reacts. Is Ferrari willing to trade for him? Or do you expect him to adapt, once again, to a culture that has proven resistant to change? Leave me in the comments what you think about all this.